Welcome back to a novel session with Caribbean and Latin American news now. Very important that you have joined. I hope that you'd like, share, and subscribe. Now, the topic for this afternoon's program is Dragon Gas Deal Could Spark US-Venezuela's War, Trinidad and Guyana in the Crossfire. This is a very important topic in light of what is happening right now between Trinidad and Tobago and the US and Venezuela and this Dragon gas oil or gas arrangement agreement. Caribbean leaders may think the Dragon gas deal between Trinidad Guyana, well, it's between Trinidad and Venezuela and the United States, is just business, but Washington sees it as war. Guyana's oil boom has already made it the hottest battleground for foreign powers, and how the US is turning up the pressure on Venezuela, threatening to drag the whole Caribbean into a conflict. Could this deal spark the next oil war right here in our backyard? Let's break it down. And this is very important that we understand. The Dragon gas deal between Trinidad and Tobago and the United States and Venezuela is more than just an energy agreement. It could be a spark that ignites a dangerous showdown in the Caribbean because we see now that the United States is actually escalating the pressure to have regime change in Venezuela. With Guyana's oil boom shaking up the region, Trinidad positioning as a gas hub, and Venezuela fighting to hold on under US sanctions, Washington is turning up the pressure. Is the US preparing for another oil war, this time in the Caribbean and Latin American region? And what does this mean for CARICOM, Jamaica, and the future of Caribbean's sovereignty? Now, why the Dragon gas field is so critical? Why is it so critical in this sort of saga? How Guyana and Trinidad's energy moves tie into US strategy, and what's really at stake for Venezuela, and why the Caribbean could be pulled into a new geopolitical war, and something that we have to be conscious about. Now, there was an article that was written in this newspaper, Daily Express. I think it's a Trinidad and Tobago's newspaper online, and the writer of this piece is Anna Ramdas. And the title of the article was published yesterday, October 3rd, October 2nd. Today is October 3rd, right? So it was published yesterday, October 2nd. Dragon deal will advance with peace. Dragon deal will advance with peace. And the word peace caught my attention. And the article went on to say that Energy Minister Dr. Rudolph Mulilal has expressed confidence that the Dragon gas deal with Venezuela will advance peacefully once the United States issues the necessary license from the Office of Foreign Assets Control, that's the OFAC. Now, for those of you who do not understand the Dragon gas deal, Trinidad and Tobago had entered into a deal with Venezuela to have them explore, to have gas be, explored, to have gas be, what should I say now? What do you do to gas? Not to be explored, but to be able to rev up their oil and gas exploration and sales. Now, there is said to be a huge amount of gas and oil in the Dragon area of Venezuela. And the Trinidadians have entered into agreement with Venezuela with the permission of the United States under the PNM, the government of Keith Rowley, and afterwards Stuart Young. But we noticed that when Kamala Persad-Caesar came into power, that oil gas agreement was actually annulled. The license that they received was actually nullified by the Trump administration, even though the Trump administration had given Stuart Young the permission when he went to Jamaica and spoke to the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. But when Kamala won the election in 2000, on April 28th, rather, the permit was actually revoked, the license that would have enabled Trinidad and Tobago to collaborate with Venezuela in oil and gas production in that era, because the dragon gas era is within the Venezuelan waters, but it's also bordering the maritime era of Trinidad. So it was their collaborative effort that would have facilitated this sort of agreement that the Trinidadians had with the Venezuelans. But no sooner had Kamala Person B. Caesar entered office than this agreement had been annulled. It had been totally nullified. And she said that the agreement was dead. However, because she went to the United Nations conference the other day. She journeyed all the way to Washington, D.C. from New York to have a meeting with Washington, or with some of Washington's authorities. I think including Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, in which they're telling her that they will, restore this agreement. They will reestablish this agreement on the condition that Nicolas Maduro, even though that they are going to be actually, having the agreement with Venezuela, and he's the current president of Venezuela, the United States is suggesting that the agreement can continue, can go on. Only that Nicolas Maduro will not be able to benefit from such an agreement, such an arrangement. Now, I'm saying, if he is the current prime president, rather, of Venezuela, how is it that he's not going to be able to benefit if he is the highest Venezuelan representative? But my understanding is that I think the United States is planning an invasion of Venezuela, and they are reestablishing or restoring this dragon gas license per the event that they will be able to depose Nicolas Maduro as the sitting president of Venezuela. So I think that their hopes are actually cemented, anchored in that sort of futuristic military invasion of Venezuela, which will see the president of Nicolas Maduro being demolished and being broken up, and being replaced by, of course, a U.S. pawn, a pawn that the United States has selected. And the United States then will be able to control the oil and gas fields of Venezuela and also of Trinidad and Tobago. This is what the war is really about. It doesn't seem like the war, as they are suggesting, is about dismantling drug trafficking, as we have been told. But the war is evidently about the fact that they would like to control all the oil and gas fields of the Caribbean and Latin American countries. And we know that Venezuela sits atop very large oil fields, if not the first in the world, but could be the second. But it has a lot of oil, right? So that is what we have to understand. And look at what the Minister of Energy is saying here from Trinidad. That's Munilal. Now, speaking with the media yesterday, Munilal recalled that the United States government had revoked a license previously issued at the People's National Movement, that's the PNM administration, to facilitate the Dragon project. He said that in record time, just 4 to 5 months, Prime Minister Kamala Person B. Caesar had acted to reverse this decision and reposition the project. Now, this is an important question that he's being asked here. Asked whether the Trinidad and Tobago government recognized Nicolas Maduro as Venezuela's legitimate president and was willing to work with him on the Dragon deal, Munilal said, well, first, let me say, and I quote, these are the words of Munilal. Well, first, let me say that I've said before, and I've said, the thing is breaking up, and I've said repeatedly that we will work with all stakeholders The government of Venezuela is a critical stakeholder here, of course, given the circumstances of the Dragon Project, and we are willing to work with all stakeholders, and we have demonstrated that. Now, he's not denying he's not saying that he will work with the president, the current president of Nicolas Maduro, as a legitimate president. Neither is he negating the fact that he might not work. He's saying that he's willing to work with all stakeholders. So in other words, he's pussyfooting, he's actually deflecting. Okay? And he's not saying whether or not he is willing to work, yes or no. Okay? And this is something that we have to be looking at very carefully, because it is something that is going to affect the Caribbean region and may ultimately plunge us into a war or into a warlike zone. Excuse me. So it's very important that we watch what is happening with this sort of arrangement. Okay? Now listen to what they're saying about the Dragon gas field. The Dragon gas field, located in Venezuela waters near the maritime border, is estimated to hold between 3.2 trillion and 4.2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. It's a lot of gas, natural gas. Munilao said the field represented a significant resource base that could generate substantial benefits for Trinidad and Tobago. Okay? So that is what he's saying. This is the amount of the quantity of natural gas that Dragon gas field has. Okay? Now, this is what, if they're able to come up with an agreement in which the Venezuelans are going to perhaps, allow the North Americans to control the gas field, maybe there won't be any war. But if Venezuela insists that they ought to be the majority in terms of shareholder, I think that there is going to be ultimately a war. And I was actually reading an article in the Guyanese, one of the Guyanese papers yesterday, in which the particular writer was suggesting that only 2% of the oil revenues that comes from the production of oil in Guyana go back to the state. 2% return to the state. 2%, a measly 2%, which means therefore that Guyana is not benefiting, not even in the least, from the oil and gas production there in their country. Okay? So if the Trinidadians are not careful enough, and they should be more experienced in the business, they've been in the business for years, for donkey's years, for decades. Okay? If they're not very careful, the United States is going to dominate the oil fields in Venezuela should the United States invade and depose Nicolas Maduro, and then will also dominate the oil fields of Trinidad, plunging the country into poverty. Because wherever the United States goes, that's what it does. It controls people's natural resources, and then it plunges the majority of people into poverty. And I don't think that it is any coincidence that Trinidad is not doing well economically at the current moment. So they will come and they'll go there with the IMF, and they will tell you that you have to take out loans at the World Bank, which will further plunge the people into more poverty if they control, while the oil fields are being dug up and they are wreaking huge sums of property, huge quantities of property. Okay, so that is what is going to eventually happen if the Venezuelan president is deposed. So the Trinidadians, have to be very careful about this, because while they're thinking that the dismantling of criminality and criminal networks in Trinidad is dependent upon the deposition of the Venezuelan president, that is not true. That is not true. Because the more poverty that you have in a country, check Jamaica, is the more crime and violence and drug trafficking and human trafficking that is going to take place in that particular country. Okay? And I'm sure that when the Trinidadian company, the oil and gas company, was closed down, I think in 2018, you could see that the country was being plunged into, you could see the correlation between the high rates of homicide, crime and violence, drug trafficking that was going through Trinidad. The wealthier a country is, the less of that you will have. The more poverty-stricken the country is, like Jamaica, and at the time, and some other countries, including Brazil, well, Brazil is not necessarily a poverty-stricken country, but most of the people are poor. Okay? It's a resource-rich country, but the majority of the people in Brazil are poor. So you have a lot of that happening there. Okay? So I would think the Trinidadians have to be looking careful and say, if Venezuela assents to North America's arrangement, agreement, and it seems like a lot of what is in the report, in the agreement, citizens are not privy to. So be careful what we think we know and we don't know. I think there's a lot that we don't know, if truth be told. And people like to think that they're taking sides, they're on Maduro's side. I'm not on Maduro's side. Neither am I on Cam de Caesar's side. I'm not on any politician's side. I'm on the truth side and what is right, principled, and decent. And as far as I think this dragon gas would have benefited Trinidadians if they had stuck with the Venezuelans, because at least, they weren't going to be, invading. Venezuela had no intention of invading the Trinidadians or the Guyanese, unless there is a provocation for war, as we see the United States doing. So I think it would have been more beneficial. And also we have to look at history. During the agreement that we had, the Petrocaribe agreement between the countries of the Caribbean and Latin America, that with Venezuela, in which they could have received oil and gas at a cheaper rate than on the world market, which the United States broke up that agreement. But Jamaica and no other country in the Caribbean or Latin America complained about such an agreement. It meant that Venezuela honored its agreement and that indeed the countries were actually saving. So I think it would have been more beneficial for the Trinidadians to have entered into an agreement with the Venezuelans if they were a sovereign country, which they are not, which we don't have any real sovereign country in this world in 2025, something that we have to understand because we live in what we call a global village. Globalization has broken up, I would say, 90% of what is known as sovereign states. Okay? So I think that it would suit the Trinidadians to pray that there will be peace and that the United States will rescind on its decision to invade Venezuela, because if Venezuela is invaded and the United States actually, puts into power a person of its own pawn, its own puppet, it means, therefore, that the Trinidadians are going to be plunged into deeper poverty. Because the United States, as soon as it controls your oil and gas and other major natural resources, is going to actually divvy up and divide all of those natural resources and place them into the pockets of its oligarchs, of its American and Trinidadian or Guyanese or whomever oligarchs. And that is how the people on the whole will be plunged into greater poverty. Hope you're understanding. Hope that you've learned something from this. Please make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to publish another one soon. Let me know if you agree with me in terms of this whole matter of war, that the whole war drums that we see are being beaten, are being drummed up is over the oil and gas agreement between Trinidad and Venezuela. But we also can't also deny the fact that the Essequibo region in Guyana also, that is also about oil and gas and who should control what. Should the Venezuelans control? Should the Venezuelan Guyanese control? Or should North Americans, should the Shell and all of these major gas, and natural oil and gas companies control the region's oil production? Please let me know if you agree or disagree with my assertions. All the best to you. See you another one. Bye.